This episode is brought to you by Magic Mind. We don't get a lot of giant carnivorous bat monster sightings on this show, but I'm proud to say that today in the first story, you're gonna be a little surprised and terrified. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on X at Dark Prevails. Today's episode is a brand new volume in the infamous Scary Cabin Stories series, featuring disturbing creatures, demon-possessed cabins, and lots of snow. Enjoy, and don't forget to send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org if you want them narrated on this show. Sign up to be a member at eeriecast.com/plus for exclusive bonus content, remove all ads, and more. I'm trying to get as many members as possible because it's getting more and more expensive to run these shows and podcast algorithms keep changing, for better or for worse. Finally, help us make Unexplained Encounters the #1 horror podcast in the world by following and reviewing us on Spotify and Apple. Thank you. You know, I've noticed something interesting about diving into these dark stories night after night, sometimes too late into the night. In 2024, I stayed up well past 1 a.m. almost every night, getting work done, and that quickly took its toll. I found myself lying awake at night, tired but still unable to sleep properly, and the next day I would lose focus when I needed it most. It didn't take me long to realize I needed to start investing in what I now think of as my mental wealth, not just my mental health. Basically treating my mental resilience like a savings account I could draw from when things got intense. That's when Magic Mind approached me, sending me a sample of their focus elixirs and sleep elixirs. I took the focus elixirs for about a week straight. They're small, tasty, and easy to remember. I just took a shot every morning, and I started to feel like I was more present during my narrations, becoming less and less empty-headed, you know? The sleep formula has been especially helpful for those nights when these stories follow me to bed. Now, Magic Mind isn't the end-all be-all tool to get you exactly where you need to be, but it is a step in the right direction, a helpful step. The right combination of nutrients that you might be missing to help you focus, to help you sleep. If you want to invest in your own mental wealth this year, you can get 45% off your Magic Mind bundle at magicmind.com/darknessprevailsjan. And that's Jan like January. Link in the description. Make 2025 the year you invest in your mental wealth. Improve your sleep. Get back your daytime clarity. Magic Mind can help. That's magicmind.com/darknessprevailsjan. Now, let's begin. Full moon brings the winged things. From Erica V. It was the summer I turned 16. That's a fact I won't forget due to the freaky stuff that happened at our family's cabin in New Mexico. We used to go there every year. My parents, me, my older brother, and sometimes my aunt, uncle, and their kids too. It was this kind of double family staycation in the woods for about a week. Normally, it was just super chill. We would fish, roast hot dogs, play board games, and we'd always come home with stories of silly cousin drama or how many fish we'd caught. But that particular summer, it was totally different, like goosebump-inducing different. And I think the fact there was a full moon for 3 nights in a row might have been important. Anyway, I was living in Arizona at the time, still do actually. And that year was just not good for me in school. I'd had a falling out with a close friend, and I was feeling pretty down about my weight, just my body image in general. To be honest, I wasn't super excited to go on this trip, because I wasn't really excited about anything at the time. But Mom and Dad insisted that fresh air would do me good, so I figured I might as well tag along and just mope in the woods instead of at home. Little did I know, mope was not exactly what I'd end up doing. The cabin is in the northern part of New Mexico, tucked away in this heavily forested area near a small river. It's cozy, not super fancy. There's no cell service except for a spot near the edge of the front porch. Really just enough to get a text out every now and then. We arrived in the afternoon. My aunt and uncle and their family weren't there that week, due to some scheduling conflicts. That made the place feel a bit quieter than it usually is. My brother and I helped Mom bring in groceries, and Dad started to set up the grill. We played a bunch of board games that evening. Scrabble, Cranium, even Uno. And surprisingly, I was having a good time. It felt kinda nice being disconnected from everything else. The next day, Dad took us fishing down by the river. My brother is all about fishing, but me, not so much. Still, I tagged along, walking around taking pictures of random trees and trying to clear my head. That day was a beautiful day, sunny and warm with a cool breeze. After we got back, we roasted hot dogs outside. The moon was already looking huge even before the sun fully set. I remember joking with Dad about how bright it was going to get. Eventually, everyone trickled back indoors, but I stayed out a little longer by the fire pit, enjoying the quiet. My dad is a big teddy bear. He came over before heading in and told me how much I meant to him. He kissed my forehead, even though I was a teenager then, and I rolled my eyes. It felt sweet. He told me he would always be there for me if I needed to talk. It was one of those moments that made me feel safer than I had in a while. He went inside after that, and I just sat there scrolling through my phone, attempting to send a text to my friend back home. That's when it happened. First, I felt this weird hush come over the forest, like all the nighttime insect sounds and owl hoots just died out. Then I heard this whoosh, but it was above me, not around me, so it didn't blow my hair or anything. It was like some huge gust of wind had cut through the treetops, which freaked me out because all the leaves and branches started rustling in a wave, almost like a wave of silence rolling across them. It gave me goosebumps. I sat there totally still, heart pounding in my ears. It sounded big, heavier than any bird or even some raccoon scampering about. And after the thud, there was this clicking sound, really loud clicking. I was so creeped out. The first thing that popped into my mind was that it sounded like echolocation. That clicking went on for a bit, echoing through the quiet forest. I couldn't see anything because it was so dark, though the moonlight helped a little. But the thick canopy overhead didn't let me see the actual shape. After a while, the clicking just stopped. Then, steadily, the normal forest sounds started creeping back. I was about to quietly step back toward the cabin when another whoosh came. This time it was followed by a heavy thud on the ground, maybe 20 yards away from me. Then there was this high-pitched squeal, like a rodent or something in agony. It freaked me out so bad that I stood up, ready to bolt away. But I looked up just in time to catch a glimpse of this huge bat-like thing flying away, and it was holding something in its claws, something that was squealing. I ran inside so fast, I nearly tripped over the porch steps. Dad was still in the kitchen getting some water, and my brother was sprawled out on the couch with some old VHS movie playing on the TV. I probably looked like I'd seen a ghost, because Dad's eyes went wide and he asked what was wrong. I told him that I'd heard something. I saw something out there. My heart was racing so quickly I could barely get the words out. My brother paused his movie, and the two of them stepped outside with a flashlight. They were out there for a good 15 minutes or so, but when they came back, they said they didn't see anything. Well, except they did find some blood on the grass near where I heard the thud. They came back in looking a little concerned, but also kind of like, well, maybe it was an owl that grabbed a rabbit or something. The next day, my dad, my brother, and my uncle, he came by just for the day, decided to go hunting. They were gone for hours, so the ladies, as they called us, just stayed around the cabin chatting, watching TV, and eventually, my aunt, who had also come along with my uncle just for the day, taught me how to make Grandma's old French silk pie recipe. It was fun, and I felt more relaxed. Sometimes being busy in the kitchen is the best distraction. and my aunt is the kind of person who's always full of funny stories and cooking tips. When the guys came back, they'd gotten a decent-sized buck. They were very, very proud. My dad and uncle took it behind the cabin to skin it, and I remember hearing them talk about burying the remains in a deep hole maybe 25 yards from the cabin to keep wild animals from sniffing around too close. They quartered it up and stuck the good meat in the freezer. Then they grabbed shovels and went off to do the burying. The rest of the evening passed without anything weird happening. We had a big family dinner, watched some random TV shows. Then, after my aunt and uncle left, we headed to bed. I was sharing a room with my brother in the cabin. My brother's 19 years old at the time. I was awakened in my bed from him suddenly shaking me. It was around 2 a.m., and he whispered, "Hey, wake up! You need to see this." I was super groggy and instantly grumpy, but he insisted that I look out the window. So I stumbled over and peeked through the blinds. Sure enough, there was something moving around near the spot where they buried the deer remains. The moonlight was bright enough that we could see pretty clearly. Something had dug up the hole, like easily dug it up, and as I recall, that hole was about 5 feet deep. It was pulling out chunks of the deer's innards and feasting on them. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. It appeared to have leathery skin and these folded up wings sort of hunched behind its back. I could make out weird jerky movements as it tore at the remains. My brother whispered, "Is that the thing you saw last night?" And I just kind of nodded. We both stood there, freaked out but quiet. We didn't want to make too much noise. My brother didn't wake Dad up yet, said that thing would take off the second it heard a door open or footsteps. So instead we watched. I had tried to grab my phone to take a picture, but my camera was terrible in low light. The whole shot came out almost entirely pitch black, no matter how hard I tried. I remember feeling so frustrated, thinking no one's gonna believe this, but mostly just terrified that at any moment it would look at us and see us. Eventually, it must have heard something or sensed our presence. Heck, maybe it got done. It stiffened up and then took off in this clumsy hop and flew away into the trees. The next morning, we told Dad everything. My brother was all pumped up, saying we should stay up that night outside to try and spot it again, maybe even shoot it. Dad wasn't exactly thrilled with the plan. He's a big, sweet guy, but he also hunts, so he can handle a rifle. Still, he's not the type to go out guns blazing on a wild animal. And yet, he didn't want my brother doing something stupid or dangerous. So eventually, he relented. "Fine, I'll stay up with you two, just to keep an eye out. But if it gets too late or too sketchy, we're done." We agreed. That day was super weird. I kept glancing up at the trees, expecting to see something, imagining it perched up there watching us. My brother was on edge too, or maybe just overly excited. He seemed super cool about it, but knowing him, he was probably anxious. When night fell, Dad, my brother, and I plopped ourselves outside. Dad had his rifle propped up against a chair, not in any aggressive way, but just to be safe. We sat around, listening and waiting. Honestly, it was kind of nerve-wracking because you start to imagine every rustle of leaves is some giant bat monster. Dad was starting to doze off around midnight, snoring quite loud, and my brother actually joked, saying something along the lines of, "He's gonna scare it off with all that racket. Only thing he'll attract is some female Sasquatch." I rolled my eyes and smiled. We were almost ready to head back in when something told me to stand up. Maybe it was just the stiffness in my legs, but the second I did, I caught a red glint up in the high branches of a pine tree. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from the cabin lights, maybe a raccoon's eyes. But then I realized the shape was way too big to be a raccoon. I nudged my brother and woke my dad up, pointing to what I was seeing. The figure was hanging upside down, Its eyes reflected red at just the right angle when you looked at it. I could see a leathery, wrinkled face, kind of pig-like with a snout, and when its mouth opened, I swear I saw small fangs glinting in the moonlight. It was at least the size of a very big dog, but with wings. They were all folded up so you just saw bits of them around its body. Dad reached for the rifle, but he barely even moved it, and the thing instantly spread its wings, taking off in one powerful leap. I mean, it had insane hearing or some sense that we were about to make a move. We just watched it vanish into the black sky, and all three of us stood there in shocked silence. The next morning, we told Mom what we saw. Of course, her reaction was half disbelief, half, "Wait, you're serious?" But my brother and I, plus my dad, were absolutely sure. We talked about it the rest of the trip. And after we got home, it would be brought up at school sometimes. But people just laughed or said you watch too many scary movies. I know what I saw. My dad and my brother know too. We still go to that cabin every now and then. But never again has there been a 3-night full moon during our stay. Just due to random scheduling, really. But it does make me wonder if that is significant. That maybe this thing only comes out during full moons. To this day, we've never experienced anything quite that terrifying again. Nowadays, I'm almost 30, and looking back, I'm pretty proud of how my family handled it. Sure, it was scary and weird, but they believed me, supported me, stayed up with me to see if I was crazy or not. It turned out I wasn't. There's definitely something out there. I think it's a giant predatory bat. But part of me wonders if it's some unknown creature that only shows up when the conditions are just right. Like a full moon, as I said before. But I do know that it's absolutely the scariest and coolest thing I've ever seen. Not saying I wish to see it again, or wish someone else to encounter it, but at the same time, I kinda wish I'd gotten a good photo. An Icy Cold Haunting, from Drabbit. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to fully understand what happened that winter at the old cabin in Colorado. Afterwards, my wife and I decided to never go back. And that's saying a lot, as it had been in her family for decades. Normally, we'd all look forward to spending a week in the mountains, especially the kids. They'd get to run around in the snow and build snowmen, and just be away from school and chores for a while. But the year we went and the blizzard hit, I swear something unexplainable happened that still gives me nightmares whenever I let my mind drift back to the cabin. It all started when my wife, Melanie, said her dad needed someone to check on the old place. He was getting older, couldn't drive up there much anymore. And so the plan would be for us, myself, Melanie, and our 3 kids, Mandy, who's 14, Alex, who's 11, and Ezra, who's 7, to head up for a long weekend. We'd make sure the pipes weren't frozen, the place was in good shape, that kind of thing. At first, I thought it would be a nice getaway from the busyness of our lives in Denver. I was looking forward to teaching the kids some winter survival tips, building an igloo or at least a snow fort, showing them how to safely start a fire in the old wood stove. The drive there was okay at first, just your standard winding mountain roads. But as we got higher in elevation, the wind really picked up and the snowfall started to get heavier. By the time we got close to the cabin, we were basically crawling along in 4-wheel drive. The kids had their faces pressed against the car windows, marveling at the giant flakes swirling around us. I told them, "Just wait till you're outside. Gonna feel like you're in a snow globe." We laughed. Looking back, it was probably the last genuine laugh we had during the trip. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it felt oddly lifeless. I know that might sound silly. Of course it's lifeless if no one's been there for months, right? But there was something more to it. It's a small 2-bedroom place with a loft, perched near a bunch of tall pines, and usually I think it's pretty cute. But in the swirling gray-white of that afternoon, the place looked kind of ominous. The roof was bowed under the weight of the snow, the windows partially frosted, the front steps slick with ice. We hustled carefully inside, cranking up the little furnace and starting to settle in. There's no TV up there, just an old radio and a couple of board games. Mel set about making some cocoa for the kids, while I dragged in these suitcases. The first thing that struck me as weird happened almost immediately. I noticed that the large carved crucifix that had always hung near the fireplace was missing. Instead, where it had been, there was now a small dark smudge on the wall, like it had been burned or something else. I asked Melanie if her dad had taken the cross down for whatever reason, but she had no idea. "He's always kept it there. You know how devout he is," she said. It really didn't make sense, but I told myself maybe it had fallen off, and he took it home to fix it. It was an eerie start, but easy enough to brush off. That night, the snow kept coming down harder than I'd ever seen. We had dinner, canned soup, as we didn't trust the old oven yet. We sat around playing some silly game with the kids. Can't remember what it was. Everything was mostly normal except the wind howling like a living thing outside. Either the place was old or it was getting bad, because the windows began to rattle. Alex asked if we could check for leaks, so I did a quick circuit around the cabin. The loft area was fine, no cracks in the windows or anything like that, but I kept getting a weird feeling in my gut. That uneasy sense you get when you swear someone is watching you. Later that night, after we'd all gone to bed, I woke up to the strangest noise. It was a distant banging sound, like something was pounding on the walls outside. At first, I assumed it was a branch slapping against the cabin in the wind. But when I sat up, I could hear a very different, deeper sound along with it. A low moan or growl. I glanced over at Melanie, who was still sound asleep. The kids were up in the loft, presumably sleeping too. I decided to check it out alone, so I grabbed my boots and my jacket. The second I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a hammer. The snow was practically up to my knees, and the wind was ripping across my face. But even through the roar of the storm, I could tell something was off. Every few seconds I'd hear that low groan, but it was impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. With a flashlight, I did a quick walk around the perimeter of the cabin. I couldn't find any branches hitting walls, no animals or people scurrying about, just nothing. But near the back of the cabin, on the old porch rail, I found deep gouges in the wood. They looked like claw marks. We don't have bears here, at least not commonly, and these marks were spaced in a way that I'd never seen from any mountain lion or other critter. They looked almost too large. That was the first real shiver of fear I felt. I ended up going back inside, locking all the doors and pushing a couple of chairs against them, just for my own peace of mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I just couldn't shake the sense that something was out there. The next morning, I told Mel about it. She looked worried. "My dad never mentioned anything like that," she said, then joked, "Maybe what you heard was a ghost." But even as she smiled, I could still tell she was worried. We spent the next day shoveling some of the snow around the front door, trying to make sure we wouldn't get stuck there. The kids built a snowman, and I tried to bury my worries in normal stuff, stoking the fire and checking if the generator still worked. I'd almost managed to convince myself the claw marks could have been from an old raccoon or something that had grown big living off the trash. But that night, the real terror started. We were sitting around after dinner when the lights began to flicker. That's not unusual for a cabin in the mountains during a snowstorm, so I got up to check the circuit breaker. But the breaker was fine, no tripped switches. Everything was normal. Right then, we heard a loud crash from the loft. The kids shouted down that something had fallen, so I rushed up there. Mandy said a shelf just toppled off the wall out of nowhere. She was shaken up, and Alex was helping Ezra back to his bed. Sure enough, the shelf that held some old family photos and knickknacks had fallen, scattering everything. I checked the brackets. They weren't broken or loose. It didn't make any sense for it to just collapse like that. We cleaned up, trying to keep the mood light, but there was a tension that none of us could ignore. Later, around 11 p.m., the kids had gone to bed. Melanie was reading by the fire and I was flipping through a magazine. Then, out of nowhere, the radio, which had been switched off, began to blare to life with static. It was so sudden and loud, I nearly jumped out of my chair. Melanie leapt up too, staring at the radio like it was possessed. I walked over, fiddling with the knob, and realized it shouldn't even have power at all at that moment, because we had turned off that particular outlet to conserve electricity. And yet there it was, hissing and crackling. For a second, it sounded like a voice came through the static. Just a hissed word or two, but it made the hair on my arms stand on end. I shut it off by pulling the plug, but even then, it crackled for another moment before going silent. Melanie asked, "Did you hear that? It sounded like someone said leave." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat. Not an hour later, we heard a scream from the loft. Rushing up, we found Mandy and Alex standing at the far end, pointing toward the corner. Mandy was crying, Alex's face was pale, and Ezra was under the blankets. They said they had seen a dark figure, tall and hunched over, standing there just moments ago. It vanished the second they screamed. I looked around, searching for any sign of a person or maybe a trick of the light. But that corner was empty. I tried to calm them down, explaining that it was probably a shadow from the firelight bouncing off the walls. But I didn't believe it. I knew something was wrong in this place. We all decided to sleep downstairs in the living room together. I piled extra blankets on the kids, and Melanie and I sat up, not really sleeping, just dozing in and out. Around 3 a.m., I heard the banging again. This time it felt like it was coming from inside the walls rather than outside. I got up with my flashlight and I quietly made my way through the cabin. Every so often I swear I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape seeming to move in the shadows. Twice I even turned with my flashlight, only to find nothing but an empty room. The whole time my stomach was doing knots. We weren't alone in here. Finally, sometime just before dawn, the storm eased up a bit, and I made the call. We were leaving. I woke up Melanie, telling her we should pack up. She didn't argue. We got the kids up and they were all too eager to get out. The wind had died down enough that we could feasibly drive back out, even if it meant tackling some pretty bad roads. We gathered our things in record time and headed for the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, I glanced back inside one time, and I swear I saw in the flicker of the dying firelight a humanoid figure standing in the hallway. It was featureless, save for glowing eyes. It didn't move, didn't run at us, just stood there. I slammed the door shut, my heart going crazy. We barely made it down the mountain, sliding around on the icy roads, but I felt an immense sense of relief once we were back on the main highway. The kids were freaked out but seemed to relax a bit once the cabin was out of sight. Melanie and I agreed we would explain everything to her dad later. But privately, she told me, "I don't want to come back here. Ever." And I agreed. We told her father about these strange events: missing crucifix, possessed radio, shelf falling, banging on the walls, the shadow figure. He listened quietly, his eyes darkening. He never did say he believed us outright, but I saw how his hands trembled a little, and he eventually admitted that his own father had experienced something evil in the cabin years back. That was enough for me. It's been several years now, and we haven't gone back, not even for a day trip. The kids don't even bring it up. I still wonder about the place sometimes, whether it's truly haunted or if something demonic lives within the walls. Maybe the mountain itself is cursed. Maybe it was a storm-induced hysteria. But every time I recall that final moment, seeing that vague shape in the hallway, I can't just write it off as my imagination. Whatever it was real, and it wanted us out. Well, it got what it wanted. As far as I'm concerned, that cabin can stay empty forever. If there's some dark force out there in the Colorado mountains, we sure aren't going to mess with it again. I hope anyone else who goes there is prepared for what they might find lurking in the dark. Because trust me, once you see something like that, your world never feels quite the same again. Not a Bear, from Far From Sloan. After quite the rough patch, I ended up in a rickety cabin out in the Ozarks. That's what happens when you lose your job, can't keep up with the mortgage payments, and your house goes into foreclosure. It was honestly horrible. My wife had passed away 2 years ago, and every day since felt like fighting upstream. Eventually, I just ran out of steam. After the bank took my home in 2014, I called in a favor from an old friend who owned a cabin in Arkansas near the edge of the woods. He said I could rent it for next to nothing, at least until I got back on my feet. I assumed it would be better than sleeping in my truck, so I packed up what little I had left and made the move. If you've never been to the Ozarks, they are beautiful, peaceful, but they can also make you feel like you're living in a different world. The cabin was off a narrow gravel road, lined by tall trees that seemed to lean in, like they were guarding some secret of their own. The place was small and run down, no TV, no internet, and the porch tilted a bit to the right. The nights there were pitch black, and the nearest neighbors were about a half-mile up the road. I told myself the quiet would help me think, help me process the loss of my wife and figure out my next steps. My first few weeks were uneventful enough. I spent most days sending out resumes from the local library. It was about an hour's drive away, though, and I spent my evenings tinkering around in the cabin, trying to fix leaks or shore up creaky floorboards. I kept to myself, really. I'd hear plenty of wildlife at night, owls and foxes and possums rummaging through the garbage, but nothing that particularly freaked me out. Actually, I almost liked it. The sense of living with nature all around me never did feel too alone. Then, around the 3rd week, I started to notice odd things. One evening, I heard snuffling sounds right outside my bedroom window. It was like something with a short snout sniffing at the wall. This was a very distinct noise, wet and heavy breathing. At the time, I assumed it was a black bear, except that I'd lived in Arkansas long enough to know how normal bears should sound. And this wasn't it. Bears have this deeper, more resonant kind of huff, but this was sharper, with occasional grunts or squeals mixed in. I remember turning off my bedside lamp so I could look out the window without a glare, but it was too dark to see a thing. When I opened up the window to try and shine a flashlight, the sound abruptly stopped, like whatever was out there decided to run off. A couple of nights later, I found fresh prints in the dirt by the porch. They were large, but not quite as big as your typical black bear paw. And what really threw me off was the shape. The toes were very long, and there seemed to be more of a curved arch. This made my hair stand on end. Could have been some sick or mangy bear, sure, but something about those footprints were just wrong. That same night, I found claw marks along the side of the cabin, near the kitchen window. They were arranged horizontally, as if something had reared up on its hind legs and raked long, curved claws across wood. It didn't look like the usual bear scratch to me. I began to form a sort of legend in my head that some local variation of a black bear, or some other critter, was living out here along with me, and whether or not it was peaceful remained to be seen. I'm no zoologist, though. Every passing day brought more unsettling evidence that something unusual was nosing around. One morning, I woke up to find the trash bin flipped over, the lid half chewed, and there were these strange grayish hairs caught in the hinge. The fur was sparse, thin, almost patchy, and the strands themselves were coarse. It looked more like a boar's bristles than bear fur, even though they were too long to be from a boar. As the weeks went on, the nightly visits became more frequent, at least 3 or 4 times a week. I'd hear shuffling footsteps just beyond the porch. Occasionally, I would catch sight of a broad, hunched form loping between the trees, if there was enough moonlight. I never got a crystal clear view, but from the glimpses I managed, I saw that it had a heavy frame, a snout like a hog's, and patchy fur that looked like it had suffered from some disease. Seriously, it gave me the creeps. I tried to tell myself that it was just a black bear, a diseased black bear. But deep down, I didn't think it was that simple. One night, I heard a deep, ragged grunting near the back door. It sounded frustrated, like it was trying to get inside but couldn't figure it out. I grabbed my baseball bat. I didn't have a gun at the time, and I tiptoed to the door. There was this moment when the two of us, whatever was outside, and me inside, just stood there. I could feel it out there through the thin wood. I could hear a low, snuffling breath. My heart was racing so loud, I was sure it could hear that. Then, just like before, it moved on, leaving me there with beads of sweat dripping down my face. Things escalated a bit when it started to claw at the windows at night. I'd wake up to the sounds of nails scraping glass. Made me think it was trying to find a way in and was testing places. Once it left smears on the window, a greasy, foul-smelling residue that took me forever to clean off. I began to dread sundown out there, lighting candles around the cabin more for comfort than actual illumination, like a bit more light would keep that thing at bay. When it wasn't skulking around, I was dealing with my own misery. Grief for my wife, the stress of being broke and nearly homeless, the uncertainty of my future. The cabin felt like a prison sometimes, but I stayed because it was cheap and I didn't really have any other options. My friend said I was welcome to crash there indefinitely, and pride wouldn't let me go begging to family members for a spare couch. So I stuck it out, hoping the creature would lose interest. Then came the worst night, the night that I think it nearly ended me. It was late March by then, a bit warmer, and the woods around the cabin smelled of wet leaves and fresh sap. I was outside on my porch, pacing around with a mug of coffee, trying to just enjoy the peace. The hair on the back of my neck was up again, though, that sixth sense telling me I was not alone. Sure enough, I heard branches cracking to my left. I swung my flashlight around, catching a glimpse of that shape, big and hunched, covered in sparse, patchy fur, and that short hog-like snout. This time, it was only about 20 feet away from me, half hidden behind a tree. When our eyes locked, I heard it grunt at me, a continuous grunt that slowly rose to a high screech, and in one huge stride, the thing loped towards me. I began to panic. I dropped my flashlight and sprinted off the porch, hoping I could circle back around to the cabin door before it made it to me. My boots slipped in the mud, and I could hear the creature breathing. It was so close. I could hear snarling and snapping branches, and it was getting closer. I managed to weave between a few thick pines, the adrenaline in my body the only thing keeping me moving. I heard heavy paw steps, if you could call them paws, just behind me, and I swear I could feel hot breath on my neck. I whipped around a tree, almost smashing my face into the trunk. I then spotted my cabin's porch light in the corner of my vision. I pushed myself forward, half sliding and half running towards the door. By some miracle, I made it to the porch, yanked the door open, and hurled myself inside. My shoulder slammed into the frame, but I didn't care. I kicked the door shut with my foot and threw the bolt. Afterwards, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Outside, I heard that thing howl. It was awful, a deep moan that ended in a pig-like squeal. It was so close, I could hear the wood of the porch creak under its weight. My entire body shook. I listened, heart pounding. For a few seconds, it pawed and scratched at the door. I prayed it wouldn't break through. Then abruptly, it must have run off, because everything went quiet except for the blood hammering in my ears. That was the last straw. I couldn't handle living in that cabin anymore. Within a week, I found a temp job down in a nearby town. I made enough cash to fuel up my truck, and I drove away. I told my friend he could keep my last month's rent. I was done, though. I don't know if he believed me about the creature. He just shook his head and said he would look into it. I thanked him over and over again for letting me live there. But I never went back to find out if he saw anything. Nowadays, life has been a whole lot kinder. Got a decent gig that pays the bills. Even moved into a small apartment where I'm far from any dense forests. I have the occasional nightmare about that night. I think that's normal for this kind of trauma. And it is trauma. Being pursued and nearly attacked by a large animal, it sticks with you. I may never truly know what that thing was, but I learned that we share the world with things we don't fully understand. Some things that might want to eat you, or at the very least, drag you through the hills of the Ozarks. Something wrong with nature. This happened when I rented a cabin in Minnesota. It was tucked away in the north, on a piece of land that's mostly pines and thick undergrowth. I thought it was quiet when I first checked it out. The place had a rustic charm, with a wraparound porch and an old wood stove. Plus, there were no neighbors for a couple miles. I'm not exactly a survivalist, but I can chop my own firewood and handle some simple repairs when I need to. On my first trip to the cabin, the weirdness started a few weeks into my first spring. I woke up early one morning, glancing out my kitchen window. About 20 yards away stood a deer. At first, I was in awe, seeing beautiful wildlife so close. Deer are common around these parts, but not common where I'm from. But this one was frozen in place and was staring straight at the cabin. It wasn't nibbling at the grass or flicking its ears at bugs. It just stood there, eyes locked on me, not blinking. It felt unnatural. I even tapped on the window to see if it would do something. Then I opened the window and called out. And still, no reaction. Finally, I went out onto the porch, thinking it might finally run away from me. But instead, it sort of just meandered off, slow and steady, all the calmness in the world. I shrugged it off as a quirk of wildlife around these parts. Again, I'm not experienced with wildlife. Then, a week later, Around 2 a.m., I heard thumping. When I flipped on the porch light to check it out, I found a raccoon hunched over by the garbage bins. But like the deer, this raccoon was not acting right. It didn't scatter when the light hit it. It stared back with these glassy eyes, almost as if it was studying me. Then I watched it climb the porch railing, slowly, without that twitchy caution raccoons usually have, those I've seen on TV and YouTube. It actually pressed its nose against my screen door and just stared at me through it. I banged on the door and it hissed, but didn't budge. I ended up grabbing a broom and swinging it. Finally, the thing hopped down, waddled off a few feet, and disappeared into the woods. The whole thing just threw me for a loop. After that, more animals started to act strange. Squirrels would perch on the fence post for hours at a time, turning toward the cabin like they were listening to me. At one point, I looked out the front window to see a half a dozen crows crowding up a single branch, and all were completely motionless. Not a single caw, not a single flap, not even a single head turn. They were just perched and frozen, watching the cabin. It was the creepiest thing. I tried telling a buddy of mine in town, but he laughed at me. Well, if you think it's so weird, consider getting a wildlife camera. Could be a neat project. So I listened to him. I bought a couple of these cheap trail cams, setting them up around the property. The footage I got was downright unsettling. When animals would wander into frame, they would pause, turn right toward the camera even if I'd hidden it quite well, and remain there for minutes. I'd see a red fox approach, sit, tilt its head unnaturally far, and stare at the lens. Then it would leave like it suddenly lost interest. It reached a tipping point when a bald eagle landed on the roof one evening. I heard the scratching of talons on the shingles. I ran outside and saw it hunched at the peak, glaring down at me. That was the moment I truly felt something was off. Animals just don't behave like that. They just don't. The final straw came about a month after that. It was nearing dusk, and I decided to take a walk along the tree line. The air felt thick and still. I was maybe a quarter mile from the cabin when I heard rustling in the brush. I froze, expecting a deer or maybe a bobcat. Then I saw a shape emerge, large, definitely bigger than a coyote. It looked like a wolf, or something close to it. Its eyes were strange. They were all cloudy, not that sharp predatory focus that you see in documentaries. Some of its fur was missing in places, and where you could see its skin, it looked raw. It was staring me down with that same dull and eerie expression. I did what I thought you were supposed to do. Made myself look big, made a lot of noise. But instead of backing down, it padded closer to me. I could hear it breathing in rasping spurts. A primal fear grabbed me. Thoughts of this thing attacking me and how I would defend myself ran through my mind. Then it charged. A stumbling, uneven sprint, but fast enough to close the gap in moments. I turned and ran like a fool. I know you're not supposed to run from a predator, but I turned and ran anyway. In that moment, instinct took over. I couldn't really help it. My blood was pumping as I bolted back to the cabin. I could hear this ragged growling behind me. Almost sounded like a cough. I skimmed past a tree too close, tearing my pant leg. My knee screamed in pain. The wolf was so close, I could smell it. I made it to the front door and closed it behind me quickly. I nearly had a heart attack when the wolf slammed into the door, beginning to claw and scrape at it. That wasn't normal. I wondered if it had rabies or something. Maybe all these animals out here had rabies. Right when I was starting to think it might break through, everything stopped. There was only silence. The door never broke or opened. I peered out the window a few minutes later and saw nothing. No tracks, no wolf. Not even disturbed leaves where it might have been standing before. it just vanished. I left shortly after that, let the owner know that I wouldn't be coming back for the rest of my rental stay. Instead, I stayed with a friend in town for a while, maybe about a week, because I didn't want to go home and be alone after such an experience. I didn't exactly broadcast this story. I mostly just told people I wanted to be closer to at work. But I know what I saw. Something was very wrong about those animals. Maybe it was rabies, like some widespread, insane type of rabies. I don't want to say it was supernatural, but then again, I don't really have the best explanations. I think if I'd stayed out there any longer, I might have been killed. Wendigo of Lake Nipigon. From just some friends. In 2012, me, my friend Yvonne, and 2 others, Ashton and Leland, heard about the awesome fishing and all the snowmobile trails near Lake Nipigon. We thought we'd get a taste of the wilderness before heading back to our regular routines. None of us had any clue what we were about to get into. That cabin set up against a stretch of forest that felt heavier and darker than any of us expected. We arrived just before dusk, the sky already gray and the temperatures dropping fast. The cabin was one of those old wooden shacks with an iron stove in the corner and 2 bedrooms total. Cozy enough, I guess, but something about the way the wind cut through the pines made it feel ominous. It wasn't the friendliest welcome. The first occurrence happened the next morning. Leland woke me up at the crack of dawn and said, "Hey, come check this out." I followed him outside. The new fallen snow was covered in footprints, not the usual roundish tracks of a bear or moose. These were shaped like human feet, but elongated, too long and narrow. You could see distinct toe marks. They started from the tree line and circled the cabin twice before heading back into the woods. Whatever made them had a very massive stride. Yvonne joked that maybe we had a forest giant for a neighbor. Ashton, the most skeptical of the bunch, shrugged and said he'd seen weirder prints while hunting in other parts of Canada. Still, I wasn't sure about all that. I thought we'd be alone out here, but apparently not. Later that day, we found a frozen, half-eaten hare near those same footprints. No big deal, lots of predators out here, right? But the wounds didn't look right. It looked like something had clawed the fur away in long strips. Ashton said it looked more like a tool had been used than an animal's teeth. That's when he started to ask locals in the nearest town, whenever we were out, to see if they'd had any issues with wolves or bears lately. One old guy behind the gas station counter got this grim look on his face and shook his head, mumbling something about the Wendigo. None of us took it seriously at the time. It was just local folklore, a spooky story to scare tourists and children. We were tourists, but we weren't stupid. Over the next few nights, the wind kicked up pretty hard. In the cabin, it was like the place was rattling all the time. We tried to play some cards or heat up some soup on the stove, telling dumb jokes to pass the time. But almost every evening around midnight, we would hear what sounded like crying outside. We all assumed it was the wind howling in a sort of way. But as it kept going, I think we were all soon convinced it was more like a person sobbing, low and mournful. There was no pattern, no obvious direction. Just echoes that rose and fell, enough to give me chills, that's for sure. Yvonne decided to open the door during one of these crying sessions to see if she could find where it was coming from. The second she opened that door, the sound stopped. Outside, it was pitch black, except for the glow of the porch light. She stood there for a good minute, breath fogging in the cold, trying to see or hear anything else. Not a single noise. As soon as she closed the door, it began again, and that's when she started to believe something was out there, something that was playing with us. One morning, I took a walk around the cabin to check the generator. I found more fresh, elongated footprints around the outside. I called everyone out to show them. It was different than the tracks we found before. There were so many of them, like whatever it was had been circling our cabin the entire night. We looked at each other, unsettled, but trying to keep cool. If it was a wild animal, why would it circle us like that and for so long? Yvonne and I began to take turns staying up late, listening for crying or footsteps, hoping to catch more evidence and to finally figure out what it was. We left the blinds cracked just enough to watch the tree line. Sometimes I would see a flicker of movement when it was my turn. Pale and lanky movement. But the figure always ducked behind trees right in time. Could have been moonlight, I guess, but once, just once, I did see something directly step out. It had the shape like a person stretched way too tall, arms dangling at its sides. Its body was so skinny, you could almost see the outline of its ribs. I couldn't make out its face, but I soon realized I didn't want to. Whatever that thing was, it never lurked for more than a few seconds before sliding smoothly back into the shadows. And I swear, the footprints in the snow became more plentiful every night. One set of prints I found led right up to the front door. It must have been standing there for God knows how long, listening to us. The crying changed the following night, shifting from sorrowful to something else, a sort of plea, I guess. I thought I heard words buried in the sound, but I couldn't be sure. It sounded pained and angry. None of us were getting much sleep by then. We argued about whether to pack it up and leave, but we'd already paid for the cabin rental, and Ashton insisted we just needed to be cautious. Maybe we should start carrying bear spray as a precaution. On our 6th day, Leland and Ashton went out on the lake to try some ice fishing, but they came back early, both looking shaken. Leland barely said a word. Ashton pulled me aside and told me they'd found strange carcasses, fish with chunks torn out, not just on top, but on the sides, as if whatever ate them wanted to cause suffering more than get a meal. He also mentioned they'd spotted a set of footprints that led right to a hole in the ice, then back out again, and the shape was exactly like the ones near our cabin. Only difference was they seemed deeper, like it had been carrying extra weight on its return. That evening, none of us felt like cooking or joking around. We sat by the stove, glancing nervously at the windows. The wind picked up again, but every once in a while, we'd catch that wailing. It rose above the gusts, raw and desperate cries, like someone about to break in. Right after midnight, we heard a frantic series of thuds outside, like footsteps running, followed by guttural cries that made my stomach turn. A few seconds later, total silence again. I decided I had to see what was going on. Against my better judgment, I nudged Ashton, and we stepped onto the porch with our flashlights. Snow whipped at our faces, stinging our eyes. We scanned the area but found nothing, until Yvonne pointed to fresh tracks leading around the corner of the cabin. We followed them slowly. At one spot, we found drops of something dark staining the snow. Blood, maybe. Then the trail vanished into the trees. We could have gone after it, but we didn't. Chasing that thing was a bad idea. The next day, with less than 2 days left on the rental, I convinced everyone we should just leave early. It wasn't worth the money to stay. We packed up in a hurry, double-checking every window and door. But as we lugged our bags to the car, we saw one last thing that I will never forget. Just beyond the tree line, a pale figure stood, half hidden by branches. Thin arms hung at its sides, fingers way too long. Its eyes were sunken into the skull-like face it had, looked hollow. It was trembling, almost like it was crying, and I couldn't hear it. For a moment, I felt pity, just for a moment. I could sense despair in it. I could feel it in my chest, like it wanted me to know. Eventually, Yvonne grabbed me by the arm, urging me to the car. We drove off, throwing powder behind us. Nobody spoke until we hit the highway. Leland mumbled something about never wanting to set foot in the woods again. Yvonne just stared out the window. I think I saw tears in her eyes. Ashton was white-knuckling the steering wheel, like he was trying to outrun the end of the world. I think we all knew right then we'd witnessed something cursed. I think bats are cute when you're looking at cool animal clips on Instagram, but multiply its size a few times and see it watching you from the dark of the woods, and you'll be rethinking what it means to be alive or dead. Good night. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm Darkness Prevails, and I'm happy to have been your host this evening. Hit me up with a follow on X at Dark Prevails, so we can form a creepy echo chamber of cryptids and stuff. Help Unexplained Encounters become the #1 horror podcast in the world by following us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and leave a review. Help us stay afloat by becoming a member at eriecast.com/plus, where you can get members-only content, remove all ads, and more. Also, don't forget to check out our sponsor, Magic Mind. Get 45% off the Magic Mind bundle and improve your focus and sleep. Use my link at magicmind.com/darknessprevailsjan, or with the link in the description. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.